The End or a New Dawn by Declan Conner. A short sci-fi post-apocalyptic story. Scene 1. At a depth of 14,000 feet, Kurt Burkov checked his sonar and stopped his rapid descent. His mini-sub, affectionately nicknamed Lucy, after his mother, headed southwest along the Atlantic Ocean bed, and gradually descended further and navigated the contour of the terrain. His instrument panel reassured him that his mothership, the scientific research vessel USS Discovery, was following his progress. He always felt comfortable in the safety of Lucy's hull, like a child in a mother's womb. But after years of research work, today he felt ill at ease. He knew the ocean surrounding him had changed. He activated the onboard computer system and began collecting scientific data from Lucy's external probes. Despite Lucy's 15 lamps blazing a trail, he considered the view was akin to driving on the surface in fog. Thank God for the 3D imaging sonar on the screen, he thought. He checked his watch. 2.5 hours to go, he calculated. Kurt's thoughts turned to his son, Jason, and he cursed not being able to be there for his debut as a linebacker for his college team. A shake of the head, and he continued to concentrate on the task at hand and opened his log. Thursday, the 4th of January, 2050. Kurt twitched his nose and scratched at his head. The temperature gauge reading from one of the probes was unusually high. He tapped it. "Idiot!" he cursed under his breath. Kurt scoffed at the thought he could rectify a fault with the tap of a finger. Feverishly, he checked the other readings. Damn. The pHs are lower than I've ever seen, raced through his mind, his eyes flitting over the instruments. He put his hands together in the manner of a prayer and rested them on his lips. Kurt knew the outcome for a scenario of higher ocean temperatures and increased acidity. It was there for all to see if they could be bothered to look for it. He shrugged his shoulders when it came to mind that they had enough problems on the surface. Kurt hoped it was the allotted time to surface, disturbed at the increased temperature. He sighed and checked the time. 5 minutes, then he'd need to start up back to the surface. His mind wandered as he began to philosophize. He'd witnessed the demise of the coral reefs and the life cycle they supported. Shellfish could no longer grow their protective covers, and jellyfish thrived. He contemplated the gradual changes over the years. The sea that started as one giant sink of primeval life-giving nectar, it was now better described as a gigantic septic pool of death, having absorbed half the carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuels burnt since industrialization. Kurt shuddered at the outcome. Plankton, at the bottom of the food chain, which had fought a desperate battle for years, he knew it was no longer able to recycle fast enough to counter the deadly concoction of gases that once produced life. Lucy began to buffet in a violent turbulence, distracting his thoughts. "What the hell?" was all he managed to shout out. Thrown from his seat, his head struck the steering control. "Oomph," he groaned, then blanked out. Kurt placed his hands over his ears at the deafening sound of alarms as he regained consciousness. He wiped the moistness from his lips only to see bright red. It was his blood. Lucy seemed motionless, but the alarms told a different story. Kurt used his chair arms to lever his body to look out of the domed viewing portal. His stomach churned and his legs buckled when he appeared to be dropping fast. Kurt gripped the back of his seat to haul himself back to his feet and looked away from the viewing glass window. Disorientated, he checked the instrument panel. The readings confused him. They showed no movement. He turned to look through the portal and immediately felt inertia. "Damn, it's an illusion," he called out. A curtain of bubbles rose in his entire vision that had given him the sinking feeling. He knew it had to be methane hydrate escaping the seabed. Kurt overrode the continual sound for the sonar signal and sighed. His jaw dropped open. "Oh no, in God's name, no!" He swiveled his chair to sit down and swung around to face the control panel. Kurt took hold of the control for one of the robotic sampler arms and flicked the switch to operate the camera and light. He maneuvered the arm outward and then upward, and then turned it to scan the immediate vicinity. "Damn, I'm wedged in." Lucy had come to rest on a ledge and dislodged a large rock that had him pinned to the shelf. He was conscious of his rapid heartbeat. A glance at the pressure gauge indicated the bulkhead hadn't ruptured. He looked at the time. Hell, I must have been unconscious not to hear the crash above, he thought. His shoulders dropped as he checked the depth gauge. A tormented hour passed by. His futile efforts to dislodge the boulder had failed. Kurt had ignored the oxygen supply indicator since it hit the red zone, having disconnected the emergency buzzer. But he couldn't ignore the sour taste in his mouth or the stinging inside his nose and throat. He knew the signs of carbonic acid in his system, now attacking his organs. That meant carbon dioxide had entered his bloodstream and attacked the mucous membranes. Kurt resigned that his respiratory system was generating his own deadly fate. He pushed deep into his chair and let go of the controls. His thoughts turned to his wife and his 4 children. A picture entered his mind of her and his 3 youngest, cheering Jason on at the football game. A tear rolled from the corner of his eye and down his cheek. So many aspirations, so many missed opportunities flooded through his mind. His daydreaming came to an end with the notion he'd not survive to see them again. Kurt conjured up images of all the moments he had missed. I love you. Damn, what's her name? His brain had misfired. He took a photograph from his wallet of his wife and family and kissed it. I'm sorry if I failed you, he said. Kurt wiped the back of his trembling hand across his face. He stared at his hand and turned it over. It was clammy, covered in sweat, and his fingers trembled. Through a splitting headache, something at the back of his mind told him the end was nearing. His hand became blurred, and he blinked. One last try! He heard a woman's voice call out that he recognized, which confused him. A vision of his mom appeared. He held out a hand to touch her cheek, but the vision disappeared. Never give up. Whatever happens, never give up hope. She had said that 1,000 times to him as a child. Kurt squinted, hardly able to focus on the images on the screen. He stopped trying to focus on the instrument panel and flicked the control for the robotic arms blindly from left to right. He yawned and screwed his eyelids, hoping sleep would end his misery. There was a creaking sound of scraping metal, and Lucy lurched forward. Aware he was breathing rapidly and his vision had deteriorated, he leaned closer to the monitor, catching a glimpse that Lucy was free. His hand felt along the control panel as if he was reading Braille. He removed a catch and then pressed a button he hoped would release ballast. A loud hissing sound engulfed him. His head throbbed. Stop! He screamed at the offending flashing instrument lights, and yet more alarm buzzers. He rested his head in his arms and slumped forward, and then silence. A sensation encompassed him as though he was rising rapidly from the depths inside of Lucy. He tried to recite the Lord's Prayer in his mind, but kept mixing up the words. Kurt took one small suck of air, and suddenly felt released from his nightmare, as if Lucy had spat him out and he was floating effortlessly to the surface outside of the sub. Kurt could see the bright light of what he thought was the sun penetrating the depths as he rose toward the surface. There appeared to be 2 divers floating above him on the surface, waiting to rescue him. Only, as he neared, they appeared to be wearing white robes undulating in the current. Almost in reach of them, they held out their hands. Mama, Dad. Scene 2. The chief scientific officer stood in silence on the aft deck of the USS Discovery. His fingers repeatedly drummed the handrail. Carruthers' furrowed brow etched a scowl on his face as he watched Lucy winched into position. A glance at his watch, and he began tapping a foot on the deck. Hurry up, he said repeatedly under his breath. He began to pace back and forth. Deckhands crawled over Lucy like an army of ants. Carruthers looked at his watch, willing the hands to go backward. One of the crew called out, Engineer! Carruthers turned away. He'd seen the damage to the hatch, and he knew it wouldn't be a simple matter of spinning the wheel. Hands reached for the binoculars hanging at his midriff. Lifting them to his eyes, he scanned the ocean for any sign of Kurt having released the emergency communicator pod that contained the data of the mission. The ocean to the south was calm. As he panned toward the north, the sea looked like a boiling cauldron as far as the eyes could see. He dropped his binoculars. He'd witnessed the phenomenon before, but never on this scale. A glance over the side and he could see and feel the USS Discovery picking up knots toward the calm away from the cauldron. "Professor!" someone called out. He turned to see one of the crew exiting the escape hatch, his hand clenched and his thumb pointing down. By the time he got there, Kurt's body was laying lifeless on the deck. "We've got the hard drive intact, sir." He didn't look up to see who it was. His mind was rolling over the data he was already aware of, with the permafrost releasing methane gas, having started to melt in Siberia and western China. "Get it to comms and send the data to base. Make sure you notify Professor Duval and quote the code. Activate Polar Bear. I'll speak to him after I've checked out the data," said the professor. Carruthers looked on as a medic placed a cover over Kurt's face. A glance at Lucy's damaged and twisted metal, and he wondered how it hadn't imploded. Better let base know about Kurt. They'll need to inform his wife and family. God knows how he managed to get Lucy to the surface in that condition, he said, and sighed. Scene 3. The Oval Office at the White House. The president sat at his desk, his face almost touching the cooler fan. The air conditioning had lost the battle against the searing heat and had completely stopped working. Despite the air filtration system running to full capacity, the smell of rotten eggs hung in the air. The door opened, and Chief of Staff, Bob Brennan, entered, his shirt stained with sweat and a worried look on his face. "Mr. President, your science director is on his way to the White House. He said to tell you it's over and to activate Polar Bear." The president acknowledged and then dismissed him with the wave of his hand. He sunk his head in his hands as a bead of sweat rolled down his brow, onto his nose, and then dripped onto the diary. The date on the open page was Friday, the 5th of January, 2050. Damn, damn, damn. He brought his fists crashing down on the desk. The president took hold of his pen and with a flourish wrote, "The End." He threw the pen against the door, took hold of a photograph of his wife and daughter, and put it in the center of his desk. A shake of his head and he wiped a mixture of tears and sweat from his eyes. The few seconds seemed like hours, as he fixed his gaze on the picture. Placing the frame down, he snatched the telephone handset from its cradle. "Contact the members of the Security Council and tell them to assemble in the operations room. Advise them, Priority 1, and give the code words. Polar Bear," he said. He walked into the nearby bathroom, turned on the shower, and stripped. The temperature dial was set to cold, but steam filled the cubicle. He placed his hand under the stream of water, and it was just about bearable. Stepping into the shower, he closed his eyes and flinched at the heat of the water until his body acclimated. As the shower sprayed his face, his entire life passed before his mind's eye. Depression and the sense of being isolated overcame him. There was nothing he could do to mend what he knew was broken. No amount of executive orders could put it right. For all the status of his office, he knew he was powerless to save either himself or his loved ones, other than what the Polar Bear Protocol allowed. He'd known this day was coming, but somehow his position as the head of the most powerful nation on Earth, that had made him feel invincible, now left him with a tremendous amount of vulnerability and hopelessness. Wallowing in his own mortality, he wished he could walk away from his responsibility and to share some special moments with his family. But he knew he could not. Guilt struck him for his part in the undeclared conspiracy against mankind. All the same, he took some comfort that his group of world leaders had bought the Earth another 10 years of precious life. A shudder to dispel his thoughts, and he stepped out of the shower, dried off, and put on some fresh clothes. Over at the safe, he opened it, took out a hologram cylinder and placed it in his inside jacket pocket. Not wanting anyone to sense his distress, he pulled himself together and stepped out of the office. He smiled and greeted the secretaries along the hallway as he passed by to meet with the Security Council. "Papa, Papa." "Jenny, what are you doing down here?" he asked. "Come give me a hug." His daughter launched herself at him and clung her arms around him as he swept her up into his arms. He squeezed her with unbridled emotion. "Papa, you're hurting me." "Sorry. Give me a kiss and then run along to your mother." Setting her down gently, he held her hand. He didn't want to let go, but her hand slipped from his as she turned to skip toward their private quarters. "Mr. President, everyone is assembled. Professor Duval should be here in 5 minutes," said Brennan. "Bob, for God's sake, can you get something done about this air conditioning?" said the president. "Already have. Maintenance is on it now." "They're always on it," he replied in disgust. "Sign of the times, Mr. President." The guard opened the door of the ops room to the sound of chatter, with Security Council members huddled in cliques. All went quiet as they turned his way. He felt 20 pairs of eyes drilling him like laser beams as he made his way to the top of the table. The council members joined him and took their seats. He placed his elbows on the table and rested his chin on clenched fists. All eyes turned back to the door as Professor Duval and the head of CIA swept into the room, flanked by 2 armed guards. The guards stopped, saluted, and turned to leave, closing the door behind them. The president watched as the 2 of them walked to the podium. They carried a stainless steel case between them, fastened to both their wrists by electronic handcuffs. The president joined them and took a chain from around his neck, carrying a key. The head of the CIA did the same. Brennan and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff joined them, carrying sealed envelopes. They both placed their keys in the locks on the case and counted to 3 before turning them. The president gave a wry smile that it wasn't the nuclear football case they were opening. He knew there wasn't any need for mutual destruction. Not now the end was approaching anyway. Only the plan for a new dawn gave him any comfort. Electronic indicators lit the case up like a ticking time bomb. Brennan opened the envelope and passed the contents to the president. The president tapped in a code on the panel at the side of the lock. The head of the CIA retrieved his code and did likewise. The catches to the case sprang open along with the electronic shackles on their wrists. The case contained computer drives clearly marked with the name of each council member. Brennan took them from the case and handed them out. The president stood at the podium and addressed the meeting with a solemn tone. "Gentlemen, it's time to put Operation Polar Bear into being. I'm afraid that despite the best efforts of most nations of the world, we have all done too little too late. Some, regrettably, have done nothing at all. You're aware we have halted all civilian air flights and private shipping, among a whole host of other measures, including licensing tree felling, all to no avail. With regret, it has not been enough to stop the buildup of CO2 and accelerated warming. Professor Duval will explain fully the implications of the dire situation now facing the world. When he's finished, you're to implement Operation Polar Bear. Those drives contain your instructions as we approach the end." His voice cracked and he paused to clear his throat. "It's vitally important we keep a semblance of order and give the people of our great nation some hope." He'd said that but knew there was no hope, especially as law and order had long since broken down. No one spoke as Professor Duval exchanged places with the president and nervously shuffled his notes. The large television screen flickered to life as he pointed the remote to the screen. A map of the world appeared, showing the continents as they had been back in 2024. "I'm sure you are all familiar with the changes to the continents following the melting of the polar caps," he said. The picture on the screen morphed to show the devastating effect of rising sea levels and the reduction of landmass. "Due to the rising seas, we've already lost the Amazon as a counter to absorb CO2, along with 3 billion of the world's population due to the heat and with the food supply chain broken. And to be quite frank with you all, I'm afraid we've lost this courageous battle against global warming." He shuffled his notes and peered over his half-rimmed eyeglasses to see the response. "So, what are you saying, Professor? Are you saying that things ain't gonna get any better?" asked General Hawk. "Correct, my good man. What I'm saying is things are going to get much worse, and fast," said Duval. The picture on the screen turned to an image of the Atlantic Ocean bed, with footage retrieved from Kurt's ill-fated mission. "What we have here is frozen methane hydrate in vast quantities." As the camera scanned the seabed, plumes of bubbles could be seen rising from the depths. The professor continued. "Rising temperatures are causing the methane to thaw and to release the gas into the atmosphere." Admiral Gore interrupted Duval and said, "We've known about that for years. In fact, it's been happening for millions of years." Duval set his eyes on the Admiral. "Not to this extent, Admiral, according to the satellite images. Yes, there have always been areas susceptible to this, like in the Bermuda Triangle, and more recently off the coast of Norway and in the landmass of Siberia and western China. This is different, sir. This is global, and the amount of deadly methane to be released will be on an unprecedented scale." The Admiral ran his finger on the inside of his shirt collar. "Does this mean I'll have to recall the fleet? What about aircraft? Methane is combustible. The president rose to his feet as everyone began talking in a frenzied chatter. He held up his hand. Gentlemen, please. Order, order. Now, let the professor finish what he has to say. A morbid hush descended. The professor cleared his throat and continued. To answer your questions, yes, you'll have to recall the fleet. But just how many will make it back to see their loved ones is anyone's guess. Your computer drive will show the latest activity from satellite pictures. Any ships that hit these massive plumes of gas will simply sink. Moreover, yes, methane is highly combustible, and all military aircraft will need to be grounded. We have a window of 1 week where flights will be possible, but after that, out of the question. Eyes exchanged worried glances around the tables. Where does this leave us with the conflict in Israel? The Arab League is massing on the borders to attack. What about the task force we plan to send there? Asked General Hawk. You don't seem to understand, said the president. I think you can take it that our task force is to stand down, General. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave the Israelis to their own Armageddon. We need our troops here, as you will see when you read the instructions on your drive. Now please, let the good professor continue. The professor rubbed at his brow. Actually, I don't have much more to say, gentlemen. Other than methane gas is one of the deadliest of the greenhouse gases. Without going into too much technical detail, it has a ratio to CO2 of 25:1. With the emission of methane, our computer models have shown that temperatures will accelerate at an alarming rate. All marine life will cease to exist as the methane changes the chemical composition of seawater. This will quickly be followed by the death of 99% of all life on land as temperatures soar, and the gas pollutes the atmosphere. Luckily, it will put the last of the survivors to sleep. How long do we have? Asked the head of the CIA. The president nodded at an exchange of glances with Duval. Tell them how long. Our best estimates are, well, sorry to say this, but we have only 2 weeks left of life on Earth, said Duval and collected his notes. There was a collective gasp. Shock was plastered on the faces of each council member. Looks like Satan is finally going to be released from his chains, said General Hawk calmly. If you take Satan to be the methane, that is. The president rose to his feet, walked over to Professor Duval and shook his hand, then turned to the council members. Brennan stepped over to them. Mr. President, we need to leave immediately, said Brennan. Your wife and daughter are on their way to the secure facility, and 2 fighter aircraft are due to land here any minute to take you to Area 51. He turned to the council members. I'll see you in 3 days' time at our underground facility, said the president. I have some business to attend to. The president started to leave the room in a trance-like state, and the professor followed. He stopped at the door after snapping out of the malaise in his mind. The president turned to those assembled and said, Arrangements have been made for you to be taken straight to our underground facility, where you'll direct your command structures. Your wives and children are already on their way. He noticed a number of them with cell phones in hand. No, not one call. All cell phones must be left here on the table. They all complied in morose silence. No one objected as Brennan called in the guards to escort them to their transport. Brennan and the president made their way outside to the White House lawn. The stench of the musty air was sickening, and the heat hit them like walking into a steel door. The noise of the jet engines was deafening. Turbulence from the column of air caused by the downdraft as they angled to land vertically gave them some respite from the heat. Security guards brought out jumpsuits and helmets. Brennan and the president put them on, and they were soon aboard. As the fighter took off vertically, the president felt as though he had left his stomach behind. Then, without warning, he was forced back into his seat as they accelerated in normal flight. The only good news was that the air conditioning in the cockpit brought some respite from the hell outside. Closing his eyes, the president recalled his briefing with the head of NASA and the secretive Majestic 12, when first elected to office almost 9 years ago. What he was told had been hard to believe. All the long-forgotten rumors were true. Aliens had crash-landed at Roswell after all they'd told him. Their leader, Alien Gabriel, advised them of the impending doom of the planet. He'd brought with him a plan to save mankind from extinction in the universe. The result of the visit and subsequent revelations with the major world leaders had brought down communism in Russia and paved the way for China to join the world economy, albeit without recognized democracy. The top-secret plan they'd made him privy to was to be named the Genesis Project. He was told that the project called for nations to come together to build a space station capable of acting as a jump-off point to Mars, where they could sustain the lives of 144,000 personnel. He allowed himself a smile that it was now complete and manned by 1,000 support staff, with the youngest and brightest scientists divided between physicists, geneticists, and biologists who were assembled at Area 51 waiting flight by shuttlecraft to the station aptly named the Ark. It hadn't gone without some irony on his part to be told that computers on the Ark had been loaded with the DNA of every known creature on Earth. Since finding water on Mars, huge greenhouses had been built on its surface, following the success of the Eden project on Earth. Latest intel reports had told him that the shuttles were designed to ferry personnel to Mars, to cultivate food produce and return to the Ark with food and water supplies, to sustain the human species, until they were all safely operating on Mars. ETA 15 minutes, Mr. President, he heard in his helmet, distracting him from his recollections at his debriefing meetings at NASA when he took office. He reached to his pocket through the jumpsuit and felt for the hologram cylinder. It was meant to be handed to the leader of the Genesis Project, Professor John Edwards. He recalled the surreal encounter when the cylinder had been handed to the president by alien Gabriel himself. Told that the hologram revealed the secret of the Keeper of the Souls, on which the future survival of all humanity would depend, it hung heavy as a responsibility. The knowledge contained in that cylinder had been a hard secret to keep. There were times he wanted to shout the contents from the rooftops, but he was sworn to secrecy. As a schoolchild, he'd always wondered about the mystery of how man's knowledge had accelerated over the last 250 years. He'd never held with the notion of the evolutionists, which didn't sit well with his beliefs. Until they find the missing link, he always said, I only buy evolution to a point as regards natural selection. Now he knew, and the burden of that knowledge, although providing some comfort, acted as a gruesome curse. ETA 5 minutes, Area 51 on the port side, said the pilot. The fighter banked as it turned to alter its flight path. The view was incredible. From their altitude, the 500 shuttles on their launch pads below looked like row after row of egg crates. Upon landing, they were taken to the underground facility, where the president addressed the assembled scientists and wished them Godspeed. After his last speech, Colonel Roberts introduced the president to Professor John Edwards, the geneticist in charge of the ongoing project. Pleased to meet you, Mr. President. Pleasure's all mine. We need somewhere we can talk in private. This way, Mr. President. I have to go back to my quarters to prepare for the shuttle flight. Behind closed doors, the president handed him the hologram disc. Here, take good care of this, John. As soon as you are settled on the Ark, you must watch this in private. The secrets revealed must be guarded and handed down through the generations until the time comes for life to evolve on Earth once again. There's everything on here to instruct you in the genetic interventions you will need to make for the soul of mankind, to repopulate. Scene 4, launch time. Only 1 day later, John Edwards strapped into his seat and a sound echoed in his helmet as the pilot of Space Command announced they were prepared for liftoff. There was a tremendous jolt as the engines ignited, and his whole body trembled. He closed his eyes as he heard the most incredible roar of the engines at full power, and the vibrations escalated to an unimaginable eruption. Eyes closed, he gripped the arms of his seat with white knuckles, fearing he would be shaken apart. After what seemed like a lifetime of gritting his teeth, there was a terrifying thud, and the spacecraft pilot relayed a reassuring message to the terrified passengers. Please don't be alarmed. Solid rocket boosters safely detached. The shaking subsided as their flight path took them across the vacuum of space toward the moon's orbit, from where they would make their journey to the Ark space station. The radiation shield, protecting the viewing ports in the passenger area, retracted. John peered out, but he could only see the utter darkness of space and a smattering of stars. From out of the lunar orbit, the Earth appeared, floating alone over the lunar horizon. It was a glorious blue sphere broken by the appearance of wisps of cloud, like pure white cotton. With a lump in his throat, a tear rolled down his cheek, and he swept it away with his tongue. He felt the bittersweet taste of life in his mouth, choking on the knowledge that life on that beautiful planet would soon end. Another message came from the pilot. Approaching the Ark now. Prepare for docking in 3 minutes. John had waited a long time for this moment. This was their mission, but somehow the view of Earth took center stage, and it seemed nothing they would experience would ever take away that moment of high emotion. 1 minute to docking. John noticed that he was staring at a black nothingness. The Ark blanked the stars out from view. Then a light appeared that seemed to enlarge as they drew ever closer. At first he thought he was seeing a UFO. Then it dawned on him. It was a door opening on the space station. Light flooded the shuttle, and they came to a standstill. He heard a clunk and then a hissing as the gangway found the shuttle exit and started to create a vacuum. The crew helped them make their way to their quarters. John stopped at his door. Before entering, he noticed above the room opposite a large sign which said, Genesis Operations Department. That's your ops room, sir. You'll be directing the entire project from there. Sounds like heaven, John said with a smile. I won't have to travel far to get to work. He allowed himself a nervous laugh as he was thunderstruck by the epiphany at noticing the acronym for the command center across the hall. G-O-D clearly spelled out the word God. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and to subscribe for more stories to come. Declan Conner is the author of a catalog of full-length psychological and speculative thriller fiction books available on Amazon in all territories. You'll find the link in the description.